Powers, and I'm the principal here at University College. We're delighted to have you with us. I do know we'll have a few more folks coming in, but if they do so, please welcome them into your row. We have a full house this evening, so we are delighted to welcome you to the first of our Castle 950 talks this evening. As you may or may not be familiar, this is the 950th anniversary year of Durham Castle. And so we have scheduled a series of Castle lectures, Castle 950 talks, and community events throughout the year for our students, for our senior common room, for our local community. And this is the first of the specifically Castle 950 talks to connect to our Norman history and architecture. And our very own John Munns, a Castleman, Castle alum, and longtime senior common room member, happens to also be our Slater Fellow in partnership with the Institute for Medieval and Early Modern Studies this year. And so it just is a perfect homecoming to welcome you back, John. I'm going to do my best with a little bit of background about John for all of you to become familiar with his background. He first came to Durham as an undergrad studying theology here at Castle, and then stayed on for an MA, like many of our students do. At that time, he discovered a love for all things 12th century and Romanesque. I love this. John faffed around the Church of England for a few years and eventually started a PhD at Cambridge, looking at the image and theology of the cross in 12th century England. That was awarded in 2010, that PhD, and eventually became John's first monograph, Cross and Culture in Anglo-Norman England. Following a postdoctoral fellowship in London and a first temporary teaching post at the University of Bristol, John returned to Cambridge. In 2012-14, he was a temporary lecturer in the history of medieval art in the Department of History and Art. And since 2014, he's been a fellow in history and art history at Magdalene College and an affiliated lecturer in medieval history in the Faculty of History. John's research interests include 12th century Episcopal patronage. He last year co-edited a book of essays on Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester, who was the uncle and mentor of Durham's own Bishop Hugh de Puset, the man who built the building in which we are standing. The relationships between art and visionary experiences in the 12th century are among John's passions. The Christian-Jewish-Muslim exchange and the 12th century Renaissance are other topics of sincere interest. And John has been using his Slater Fellowship this year to continue his work in a survey volume on the English Romanesque. And the working title for all of us to get a sneak preview of is The Art of Norman England. We're delighted to have John here with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming him, and feel free to stay after the talk for coffee and conversation afterwards. Thank you, John.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you, Wendy. It's always slightly odd to hear what one has done. Those were my research interests, so I'm afraid you're getting none of that this evening, very little of it, because I'm going to talk this evening specifically about the castle and about the year 1072. The year in which we were told it was built. But before I start, I just want to take the excuse to say a couple of thank yous. First of all, to Wendy and to everybody here at Castle. It's a real joy to have been back this term, and a huge privilege to have Slater Fellowship. And I just want to thank you very much for your welcome to Stephen and INEMS as well. Really been great. Thank you very, very much. Being here this term has introduced me to what I think is a new experience in my professional life, at least, which is to be in a position of not wanting a term to end. I don't think everybody shares my Okay, so the purpose of this talk, as advertised, is to explore some of what we know or can reasonably surmise about people, places, and politics of the Durham Peninsula in the years around 1072. What was here? What had happened in the recent past? Who were the key players? The eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that the title of my talk contains a rather odd quotation. It's taken from the Gestion Norman Ducum, the Deeds of the Dukes of Normandy, written by one William of Jumièges, quite possibly within months of the events it describes. The Gesture is a history of Normandy, written in Normandy, this section around sometime around 1070. But it includes the earliest contemporary history that we have of the Norman conquest of England. Can it be that here we have a mention of Durham Castle in a history written before the foundation of Durham Castle, which we all know took place in 1072? Well, not quite. I've used a slightly dodgy translation, which is to say my own, to squeeze the word castle into my title. The word William of Jumièges uses is castrum, which is sometimes translated castle, but it can mean anything from a fortified town to an enclosed monastery. What it almost certainly doesn't mean at this point is what we tend to think of as a castle, a large stone-built, fortified, high-status residence with a moat and a keep. In England, at least, such things were very much a Norman innovation, an introduction. The best option here is probably to translate castrum as something like stronghold. It was likely intended to refer to the entire settlement. In fact, not only is William of Jumièges not writing about this castle, the one that we're currently sitting or standing in, he's not talking about the Normans primarily either. He's recounting the events of 1068 to 1069 and the rebellions that led to the notorious harrying of the north, which more shortly. More specifically, he's talking about a bunch of rebels from York, a ragtag group of Saxons and Danes who had got themselves into a revolting mood and then, according to William, got cold feet. He writes, and you can see it here, after the discovery of the perfidious intentions of these enemies of God, fearing the immediate return of their lord, the great warrior, William the Conqueror, the council of panic at once persuaded them to flee, and they withdrew to an area in a certain county, Cumberland, which is inaccessible on account of water and woods, where they raised a castle, a stronghold, which in their language is called Durham. From there, they organised frequent raids and remained hidden for some time while waiting for the arrival of Spain King of the Danes, to whom they sent messengers to ask for his support. Now, there are a host of issues with this passage. William has got a lot wrong. He seems to think Durham is in Cumberland, for starters. And whatever it was that he is talking about here, it wasn't built by Yorkist exiles of 1069. But none of this matters too much. I picked up on this passage and translated it mischievously for the simple reason that it rather enticingly raises the question of what was actually here before the Normans arrived and started digging this castle's foundations. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I want to try and unpick something of what life might have been like here on the peninsula in the early 1070s. Spoiler alert, it wasn't great. And then take a look at some of the key players involved in what was really the foundation of Norman Durham in and around the year 1072. I think the first thing that we probably need to note is something about Durham's broader context, its geopolitical situation, if you like, in the mid-11th century. There was then, as arguably there is now, a considerable north-south divide in what had for about a century and a half by that point been the Kingdom of the English, England. That title, Rex Anglorum, King of the English, first appears in the written record, of course, shortly after the West Saxon king Athelstan took control of Northumbria, the last piece of the puzzle, in the 920s. Since then, in theory at least, much of what we now think of as England, albeit with some very ill-defined borders to the north and west and the occasional re-emergence of a grumpy Viking warlord in or around York, had been united under a single crown. However, the period between then, just to say the second quarter of the 10th century, and the Norman invasion in the third quarter of the 11th, saw very little real integration of the old Northumbrian lands with the other former Saxon kingdoms to the south. The Northumbrians retained their own legal code, such as it was, and got on with their lives mostly fighting each other. Their interest in foreigners, as they saw them, anybody who wasn't Northumbrian, only really became aroused when they were daft enough to get in the way. The most northerly settlement of any serious size was York, still markedly Anglo-Scandinavian in its culture, and the seat for the powerful archbishop, who more often than not acted as the English king's de facto northern viceroy. York marked something of a sort of outer Norman limit of the English king's own day-to-day activities. There's York. Outer northern limit of the English king's own day-to-day activities. Much further north, above the River Tweed, and sometimes below it, one came to the sphere of the kings of Scots, and their sub-kings in places like Galloway and Strathclyde. In between York to the south and Scotland to the north, lay sparsely populated and generally pretty wild lands that we might think of as Northumbria. Very approximately Northumbria. Northumbria itself is a tricky term. It means different things to different people at different times. It's perhaps most usefully delineated by reference to its rivers, its major rivers. Following the Viking raids of the 860s, the old Northumbrian kingdom had split in half at the River Tyne. The southern part down to the Humber, becoming the Norse kingdom of York, Viking Norvik, and the northern part up to the Tweed remaining under control of the English Earls of Bamborough. By the beginning of the 11th century, it's Bamborough, on the top there. By the beginning of the 11th century, the area of the Jorvik kingdom had long since been brought under control of the English kings, and in 1006, Ethelred the Unready reunited the northern and southern halves of Northumbria under the earldom of Uhtred the Bold, head of the House of Bamborough. 10 years later, in 1016, the southern earldom returned to Danish hands following the conquest of England by King Canute and the massacre of Uhtred and his men by a rival Northumbrian warlord. It was reunited again with the north under Siward, another Scandinavian, in 1041. Siward's not so come in play had been to get himself appointed the Earl of the Southern Earldom by Canute, and then marry the daughter of the Northern Earl of Bamborough. All he then had to do was knock off his new wife's inconvenient cousin and appoint himself as his father-in-law's heir, and the two halves were back together. Having successfully married and murdered his way to his reunited earldom, Siward didn't do too bad a job of governing it. That was at least until he was finally defeated by a severe bout of dysentery in 1055. Siward left a son who, thanks to his father's clever marriage, would also now claim to be heir to the House of Bamborough, but the child was too young to succeed, so Edward the Confessor appointed Tostig, one of the numerous sons of the House of Godwin, and the king's own brother-in-law, to the earldom instead. Northumbria was now back in solidly Saxon hands, but most Northumbrians were clear that they were the wrong Saxon hands. Tostig was a West Saxon, not a Northumbrian. Got away with it for a little bit, but it came back to bite him in 1065 when the Northumbrian uprising saw him deposed and replaced with the brother of the Earl of Mercia, who immediately returned the day-to-day administration of the lands north of the Tyne to Ossulf, another scion of the House of Bamborough. Why am I telling you all this? The point is that slap bang in the middle of this divided and disputed Anglo-Saxo-Scandinavian wind and war-swept territory was Durham. By now, that is to say the mid-11th century, the lands sandwiched between the Tyne and the Tees, between the northern part of the earldom and the southern, constituted the patrimony of St Cuthbert. Technically under the protection of the Bamborough Earls, but in practice these were the domains of the Bishop and Convent of Durham. I call it for a nice Latin perk. A word to the wise: if anybody ever offers you the earldom of Northumbria, don't take it. Having lost his earldom in the rebellion of 1065, Tostig lost his life at the hands of his brother the following year at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. A battle from which, of course, Harold, his brother, rushed south to meet another invading force near Hastings. Tostig's usurper, Morcar, himself lasted as Earl for not much more than a year. In fact, in the next decade, the earldom changed hands 8 more times between 7 more men, and only 2 of them lived to tell the tale. The point of all this is to emphasise the fact that the world around Durham had long been a wild and violent one, and that was in no sense a new thing with the arrival of the Normans. In fact, the reaction of Athelwine, the last Anglo-Saxon bishop of Durham, to the Norman invasion was remarkably sanguine. I suspect that he didn't care so much who was king, as that they made generous offerings to his said shrine and were able to keep his Northumbrian neighbours in check. William of Normandy showed some promise in both regards. Athelwine seems to have submitted to him early on and was trusted enough to convey his terms for peaceful coexistence to the King of Scots. Mention of the bishop should probably be my prompt to move from the broader Northumbrian focus to talk a little bit more about Durham itself. What can we say about the settlement at the centre of Athelwine's scene? What was here? Who was here by the time the Normans started to make their way up the A1? The story of the arrival of St Cuthbert and his community in Durham is too well known for me to recount it at any length. Suffice to say that those same 9th century Viking raids that did for the old kingdom of Northumbria also did for the monastery of Lindisfarne, and the community fled to the mainland, taking the body of their saint with them. After 7 years of wandering, more than a century's sojourn at Chester streets and more Viking incursions, a bit more wandering and an encounter with a miraculous cow, the community came to Durham in 995 AD, and this is where it stayed. Bovine miracles aside, one reason for settling at Durham is obvious for anyone to see. The peninsula is a natural fortress. With only the narrow neck, this north end, sort of where we are, presenting any real point of weakness. Once cleared of the forest, with Bamborough, who just happened to be the bishop's son-in-law, sent his mental health, this rocky outcrop ensured a level of security. But that didn't mean that it shouldn't and couldn't be enhanced. We can be pretty sure that Durham had some reasonably substantial defensive walls by the early 11th century, because in 1006, the inhabitants were able successfully to repel a Scottish attack. No mean feat, natural defences notwithstanding. They did so again a generation later. On one of the occasions, and possibly both, depending on the sources, the women of Durham subsequently washed the heads of the decapitated Scots and stuck them on poles, either on the town walls or in the market square. And you can't stick your enemy's head on a wall if you don't have a wall. The probability is that Durham's pre-conquest walls were, at least for the most part, wooden. That doesn't mean they weren't substantial. And I say probably wooden. There is some archaeological evidence on the north side of the castle of pre-conquest stonework. And certainly the inhabitants of 11th century Durham had access to stone building expertise. We'll come to their cathedral in a moment. So it's entirely possible that this Norman castle, the one we're in, doesn't represent the peninsula's first stone-built defensive structure. Of course, if there were any stretches of stone walling, the obvious place for them would have been here at the peninsula's vulnerable northern edge. If we go back for a moment to that quotation from William of Juliege, with which I started, he might have been mistaken about which county Durham was in, and he might have been mistaken about the York rebels' role in its construction. But in representing Durham as a place of fortification before 1072, he was probably reflecting no reality. The archaeologist Martin Carver even suggested some years ago that there was sufficient evidence to argue that things might have worked the opposite way round from that which is usually told and believed, namely that the community of St Cuthbert moved here in 995 precisely because it was already a safe fortified site of some significance. You may be right. I hate to break it to you, but this is almost certain, there's almost certainly been a castrum at Durham for more than 950 years. A castrum, that is, not a castle. So, we can say that the Durham in which the conqueror would arrive in 1072 was almost certainly fortified, and that it's possible that some of those fortifications were in stone. And as I say, if they were, the obvious place for them to be would have been around here at the peninsula's northern neck. But what else would the conqueror have seen? Well, most obviously, not that one, but on the other safer side of what is now Palace Green, there was a cathedral. This was the Ecclesia Magna, the great church of Bishop Oldham III, that was built by the Durham community. Built with the assistance of his son-in-law, Earl Uhtred, who sourced labour for the project, we're told, from the Tees to the Crocket. It was built of stone. To It had 2 towers, and whilst not as large as its successor, it was massive. It occupied essentially the same site. Some of the sculptural remains visible in the monks' dormitory probably attest to the community's level of artistic ambition and their iconographical sophistication. And if you had managed to gain entry to the church's choir, you may very well have seen the Lindisfarne Gospels resting on the high altar. It was a place, it seems, of enormous wealth. Simeon of Durham, we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, lists in his history there are about 12.5 people in the space of about 50 years who pillaged the Church of Durham. If that many people had pillaged the Church of Durham, to start off with, it must have been a real treasure trove. It was certainly an impressive building. This idea that the Normans were the first people to build big, stone, impressive churches in England, I'm afraid, is not true, although they did take it to a new level, the phrase now is. So we have the cathedral. It seems that the bishop's house would have been near to the cathedral, and it seems likely that the houses of other senior members of the community of St Cuthbert were there too. Simeon of Durham implies as much, at least to the bishop's house, because he tells us that when it was set on fire in 1069, more of which again in a moment, Simeon recalls that the sparks from that fire reached the cathedral's towers. So it must have been somewhere over that side of the peninsula. In Simeon's hands, the fact that the flames don't follow but are blown by a sudden wind in the other direction becomes a further demonstration of St Cuthbert's miraculous powers. Be that as it may, Simeon was writing at a time, beginning of the 12th century, when there was almost certainly still people around who had known Durham in 1069. For his story about the threat to the church from the bishop's house to ring true, it's likely to have had to contain some degree of topographical accuracy. The earls of Northumbria almost certainly had a residence here too. Danish and West Saxon earls tended to base themselves in York, although Tostig and his wife Judith, for example, also developed reputations as familiar visitors and generous donors to the cathedral. But earls who came from the house of Bamborough were more closely connected still, and would undoubtedly have spent a good deal of time here, even if their main residence was further up the coast. That main residence at Bamborough, of course, stands guard over the Durham community's original home on Lindisfarne. They and St Cuthbert were centuries-old neighbours. By the 1070s, Simeon tells us that the Earl and Bishop worked in tandem, with the Earl routinely providing the Bishop with counsel in his synod. To do that, the Earl would have needed somewhere to live, and if he had somewhere to live, it would have needed to have been large enough for his family and household, and quite possibly a small troop of housecarls. So we're building this likely picture of a settlement of some size, well defended, possibly with some stone fortification, undoubtedly with a great stone church, with residences prestigious enough for St Cuthbert's successor as bishop, so a substantial wooden hall house in all likelihood, as well as for the members of the cathedral community and their families. Quite likely a second large hall house as residence for the Earl. And my guess would be to place most, if not all of this, on the other side of the green around the cathedral, probably not so very far away from where the Dean and Canons live today. Palace Green, of course, was not there. The great space between the settlement's main fortifications here on the north side of the peninsula and the cathedral and its community to the south was occupied in large part by the town itself. Perhaps some of the land of the peninsula was given over to small-scale agriculture, but it was also likely peppered with a mass of single-storey wooden dwellings, workshops, perhaps some form of marketplace. We can posit the relatively built-up nature of this part of the peninsula, particularly what is now Palace Green, not only because it stands to reason, but because we know that it was sufficiently noisome to require cleaning by Bishop Ranulph Flambard in the early 12th century in order, quote, that the church should neither be endangered by fire nor polluted by filth. Close quote. By that time, of course, both the current cathedral and the current castle were, well, in its earlier form, were well progressed. Throughout these years, the peninsula must have been something of a building site, although much more so by Flambard's time, so we could probably add one or two masons' yards and large carpenters' shops to the general hubbub. The early 12th century picture of Palestine as a dirty, smelly cluster of urban fire hazards probably holds pretty good for the 1060s and 1070s too. And what about the townsfolk? Well, alas, there's not a lot we can say there with much certainty. It's quite possible that a good number of them would have had long ties to the community of St Cuthbert, and quite probably to those who worked the lands of the patrimony beyond the river. The population of England in the 11th century was, of course, tiny in comparison to what it is today. Its largest cities, such as London, Winchester, and York, were probably home to no more than 10 or 15,000 people, so the leading cities of the country were more akin in size to modern-day Ely or Wells or Morpeth. Most settlements consisted of just a very few families, and even quite important centres were little bigger than modern villages. I don't think we should imagine Durham as too small. In 1069, it was able to accommodate an army of some 700 or 800 men, and there was enough legroom for a counter-army of marauding louts from north of the Tyne to come in, slaughter the visitors, set fire to a bunch of houses, and yet seemingly still not cause any significant harm to the permanent population. So we should probably imagine a permanent citizenry of several hundred. Not all of them would live within the walls, and then this could probably be doubled when the residents of the wider patrimony came to town for feast days or the market. Then, of course, there would need to be the infrastructure necessary to support a town of that size. There would be tantalising hints of this are left, but they are there. I'm sorry for this picture, because I don't have one what I actually want to show you. But they're somewhere there. Archaeological remains of what seems to have been an Anglo-Saxon shoemakers and a row of tenements between Savile Street and what is now Moatside. Central to all of this busyness, of course, was the community of St Cuthbert, the body of priests and other clerics who served the cathedral and the saint and provided a household for the bishop. Quite a lot of ink has been spilled by historians in trying to work out what this community was actually like, in part because our most readily available sources are the writings associated with Simeon of Durham. Simeon, of course, was an early member of the Benedictine monastic community, founded to replace the community of St Cuthbert in 1083. And what's more, he was tasked specifically by his superiors, he tells us as much, with furnishing the priory with a history, a suitable history. Simeon finds himself caught between making the case for the necessity of the old community's reform and removal on the one hand, and the Benedictine prior's continuity with St Cuthbert's familiar on the other. He undoubtedly played down some aspects of the old community's life and played up others to suit his purpose. One thing the pre-1083 community of St Cuthbert was not was Benedictine. In the main, it consisted of priests and other clerics who were married, quite normal for the time, and whose offices were inherited. Not small, but not by no means unusual. By the 1130s and 1140s, just leaping ahead for a moment, the monks of the cathedral priory can be found in Rome painting pictures of this community as having been a living scandal. The fact that these later mid-12th century monks felt they had to do this, however, offers its own caution. The evidence comes mainly from cases argued at the papal court in which the priory had to defend its title to possessions that the once belonged to the former dispossessed community. And one wonders, if the case was so cut and dried, why the priory was still needing to defend its cause nearly half a century later. There are other question marks over the record left by Simeon too. He presents the priory's foundation in 1083 in terms of personnel as an almost complete clean break. Dodgy, irregular, married English priests being expelled to make way for chaste, learned, devout, largely Norman Benedictine monks. The evidence of only one member of the former body transferring to the latter. But as David Rolleston and others have shown, there's evidence of much selective editing in Simeon's work. Far from being kicked to the gutter, it seems likely that the married clergy were well compensated, possibly to the tune of 4 newly endowed collegiate colleges. A much later copy of the Tract on Origin suggests that Auckland, Darlington, Norton and Easington were provided by way of reparation, and as Robertson has noted, the impressive church still standing in Norton dates from precisely this sort of time. The priests may have been paid off with pregnants and new communities and fine new churches. What's more, Simeon lets slip more than once that he's in seemingly cordial contact with members of the former community or their kin. He gets stories from them, he learns histories from them. And there are hints that more than one Holy Father made the transition from priest of the community to brother of the cathedral priory. There's also a reasonable amount of evidence to suggest moves in the direction of a more regular monasticism were in fact being made well before William St. Canice's foundation in 1083. Surviving masonry on the south and west sides of the present cloisters seems to belong to an earlier period than the new cathedral, maybe only a few years earlier. But even so, it suggests that preparations for monastic life were being made before William St. Canice showed up on the scene. Although members of the pre-Norman community of St. Cuthbert were not monks, most of their bishops were, after the pattern of their predecessor St. Cuthbert, and many of them had monastic brethren as members of their household. So there had been a steady monastic presence in Durham down the years, albeit a small one. The last two Anglo-Saxon bishops, Athelrich and Athelwine, brothers in blood as well as religion, were both monks of Peterborough, who had first been brought to Durham by the then Bishop Edmund as early as the 1020s, in order to help him instruct the community in aspects of monastic life. One has to wonder what we can read into that. The community of St. Cuthbert was certainly idiosyncratic. It was made up in the main of the hereditary members of a clerical elite, a sort of priestly caste, if you like. In social status, they were probably more akin to local gentry, and some probably had familial links to the local nobility, such as the Earls of Bamborough. There seems to have been a fairly permanent, if limited, monastic presence, and at least some pretense to quasi-monastic life. The first Norman bishop, Walter, was surprised, and not in a good way, to discover the community of St. Cuthbert using the monastic office instead of a canonical one. Doubtless there were some battles among them, but the evidence, such as it is, of this community's notorious evil living is very late and rather suspect. The community's descendants seem to have been looked after, and to have retained a not insignificant influence in local affairs several generations after the community was disbanded. Their most famous scion was Aelred of Rivaux, before taking the cow as steward to the King of Scotland. If he is representative of the class, then the pre-conquest community of St. Cuthbert was one of standing and substance. Unfortunately for them, they were also English, and their charism didn't fit the prevailing Norman narrative of ecclesiastical reform. So, to summarise, pre-Norman Durham was probably a settlement of some size and distinction, smelly and dirty, no doubt, by modern standards all 11th century settlements were, and set about with dangers from the Scots and the Danes, yes, but probably more routinely from their own notoriously lawless Northumbrian neighbours. But it had a great cathedral under the protection of the region's most celebrated and powerful saint, and a proud tradition of successfully repelling most of those daft enough to try to breach its defences, natural or otherwise. At its core, it had a resident community of some standing and not a little wealth. Alas, we shouldn't get carried away. This may be a plausible picture of what life in Durham looked like at some occasional high points in the 1050s or early 1060s, but it's not what it looked like in 1072. And to see why, I'm afraid we have to return to the bloody history of the Northumbrian Earls. I'm going to put up a picture of the normal chapel, not because it's got anything to do with anything I'm talking about, just because it's pretty. We last left the earldom in the hands of Morcar, deposer of Tostig and brother of the Earl of Mercia. Morcar, if you remember, concentrated his rule on the south of the earldom, the York end of things, and handed day-to-day control of the north to Ossulf of Bamborough. Unfortunately, Ossulf seems to have been reluctant to submit to William the Conqueror. Morcar, after a little bit of rebellion, had submitted and was taken hostage by William back to Normandy in 1067. In his place in the earldom, William had put Tostig's old sidekick, Copsey. William the Conqueror very probably knew that the north was pretty much ungovernable, and he had more than enough on his hands trying to secure parts of the country in the south and west. If he was to stand any chance of governing the north in any way whatsoever, it would likely be via somebody who knew the terrain, so Copsey became Earl. He lasted for all of 4 weeks, before Ossoff descended on a feast that he was having at Newburn, chased him into the church, smoked him out again, and promptly cut off his head. William returned from Normandy later that year, concentrated first on putting some rebels in Exeter in their place, who bided his time in the north. As it turns out, he had no need to chase down the murderous Ossoff, because he had already managed to get himself impaled on the business end of a robber's spear. 3 Northumbrian earls had been and gone before the conqueror had worn the crown for a year. William still showed no great desire to subdue the Northumbrians himself, and his Norman nobles don't seem to have been in any great hurry to secure lands in the barren and treacherous north. So he handed the chance to another branch of the House of Banbury, in the person of one Cospatrick. By the early summer of 1068, however, Cospatrick seems to have joined his predecessor Morkel in rebellion, a singularly unsuccessful rebellion that collapsed before the king had even got his army anywhere near York. The rebels fled to Scotland, and the king was now 4 earls down in less than 2 years. It was at this point that William sent the Bishop of Durham, Athelwine, on the embassy to Scotland that I mentioned earlier to secure an agreement for peaceful cohabitation with King Malcolm. William himself had still ventured no farther north than York. And things were looking okay for Durham. The bishop was playing nice with the king, the Scots were behaving, and the various native claimants to the earldom of Northumbria were keeping each other busy in a game of tag homicide. For William's part, he had lost 4 local earls and put down a rebellion without breaking too much of a sweat. Now might be the time to appoint a Norman Earl of Northumbria and let him spread Norman authority into the north. And he chose a man called Robert Cummin. The sources diverge a bit on what happened next. Well, not the substance. They all agree that Robert and his army got as far as Durham, as Simeon would have it, plundering all the way, which was fairly standard practice for what was likely a largely mercenary army, and that the bishop met them outside the city to warn them that the Northumbrians had murder in mind. But Robert ignored the warning, and he and his troops entered the castle of Durham. In short order, they were massacred. The chronicler Roderick Vitalis, writing some years later in Normandy, laid the blame on the townsfolk of Durham. But again, this appears to be the result of a miscommunication. The slaughter happened in Durham, but it wasn't the good folk of Durham that did it. Simeon's account is the more reliable one here. The culprits were the Northumbrians from north at the time. They burst through the gates of the city at dawn on the 28th of January 1069 and started killing. It's from Simeon's account of this massacre that we get a number of the details of the city that we've already noted. Robert's was the army of 700 who found space to lodge here. It was the fact that Robert himself had taken refuge in the bishop's house that led the Northumbrians to set it alight. That's the point at which we learn that the sparks travelled dangerously close to the towers of the cathedral, and that the citizens' prayers to St Cuthbert saw them turned in the other direction. So we learn, incidentally, that the Saxon cathedral had towers, plural, and that the bishop's residence was nearby. It's not entirely clear what role the people of Durham played in this. The contemporary historian Ribaud has made a cogent case for it being a limited one, essentially looking on in horror as 2 ruling armies laid waste to their city and to each other. From there, things went from bad to worse. Not satisfied with their killing spree at Durham, the Northumbrians marched on to York in the following spring and killed the Norman governor there, Robert Fitzrichard. King William hurried north, gave the Northumbrians a walloping, spent a week strengthening York's fortification, and then marched back to Winchester to celebrate Easter. By September, a Danish fleet under the command of the sons of King Svein, always looking for a chance to cause trouble, appeared at the mouth of the Humber, and was joined by Edgar Atheling, the heir to the Anglo-Saxon crown, half the house of Bamborough, including the former Earl Cospatrick, and, in the words of the historian Radium Anglorum, quote, the whole strength of the Northumbrians, close quote. On the 21st of September, they entered York, massacred the Norman garrison, and took the city. King William's response was the infamous harrying of the north, in the light of which, if the author of the historian Radium Anglorum is to be believed, quote, no village was left inhabited between York and Durham. that they became home to wild beasts and robbers and a source of great fear for travellers. We're told that the land was laid waste in such a way that it took 9 years to recover. More recently, historians have disagreed a bit about the extent of the destruction, and there may well be some exaggeration in the sources, but it was brutal, and it went down in infamy as the ultimate display of Norman ruthlessness. The devastation does seem to have stopped short of the lands of the bishopric above the Tees, however, so short of Durham itself. Of course, Patrick fled north, stopping at Durham on the way to warn the bishop, Athelwine, about the extent of the horror and advising him to get out of its path. According to the Historia, he warned the bishop that innocence was no protection against William's wrath, although how would he know? The bishop and the community of St Cuthbert gathered up the body of their saint and abandoned Durham for the relative safety of Lindisfarne. Of course, they were hassled by Northumbrian brigands, presumably the few that had survived, on the way. Once they were out of the way, Patrick duly took the chance to plunder the Church of Durham again. When the bishop and community returned a couple of months later to Durham, they found a burned city and a despoiled church, which we are told, deprived of all care and service, had become a tomb for the poor, the infirm and the sick, who, unable to flee, lay there dying of hunger and disease. Not long after they had begun the cleaning and restoration of the church, news reached Durham that King Malcolm of Scotland was taking advantage of the chaos by launching another invasion of northern England. It was all too much for Bishop Athelwine, who decided to abandon his bishopric and make for the continent. Unfortunately for him, the wind had other ideas, and his ship was blown north to Scotland. He never returned to Durham and died in 1071. So by 1071, Durham, once a place of some distinction, was left to recover from the depredations of massacre, fire and abandonment. It cannot have been a happy place. What's more, it was now without a bishop. Meanwhile, William the Conqueror was making plans to march on Scotland. We finally find ourselves in 1072. Having got to Scotland and concluded the Treaty of Abernethy with King Malcolm, William the Conqueror returned south, and at some point towards the end of October, he arrived here in Durham. Of course, Patrick was here, cowering probably, and William promptly deprived him of the earldom for the second time, replacing him with his relative Waltheof. We came across Waltheof earlier, although I didn't mention him by name. He was the son of Earl Siward, who had been too young to inherit it at his father's death in 1055, but was now a man in his early to mid-20s and engaged, on the king's orders of course, to the Conqueror's own niece. Here too would have been the new bishop, Walcher, whom Patrick had escorted to Durham on William's instructions about 18 months earlier. We can imagine that Walcher had spent much of those 18 months restoring the glories of his new cathedral and city. Before Christmas, work had begun on the new Durham Castle, and these three men, William, Walcher and Waltheof, could probably jointly be considered to be the castle's founders. There are two accounts of William the Conqueror's time in Durham that have come down to us. I'm sorry, I missed a slide already, sorry. There are two accounts of William the Conqueror's time in Durham that have come down to us. One of them, surprise, surprise, it comes from Simeon, has him fleeing out of Durham via Kingsgate in a hot flap because St Cuthbert had decided to play around with him. I think we can put that down to Simeon's relentless campaign to dig up the power of St Cuthbert. Rather more reliable is the account produced by the pre-monastic community, and therefore fairly close in time to the events it records. According to this account, William approached the shrine reverently, asked for the story of the saint's life, and having heard it, placed a pallium and a gold mark on the altar in token of a solemn promise to guarantee the lands and privileges of the Church of St Cuthbert. As William Ayres has noted, such a public display of devotion to St Cuthbert and the promise of protection for his privileges by the king can have done the standing of the newly appointed bishop no harm at all. The pallium was the symbol of ecclesiastical jurisdiction and a clear sign that Walcher had William's endorsement, and the gold mark would have invoked an act of homage by the vassal to his lord. William gave other gifts too, The important estate of Waltham in Essex was one of them, the revenues of which were to fund the building of this castle, a sure sign that it was to be a substantial and expensive enterprise. The Waltham funds kept flowing to supplement the project throughout the episcopates of Walcher and his successor William of St. Callis, and were only remitted by Henry I's Queen Matilda in 1100. Walcher was an interesting choice for a bishopric. He was not a Northern, but a Lotharingian, and not a monk, but a secular cleric from near Liège. Nothing much is known about his earlier career, nor how he came to the conqueror's attention. But he had a reputation for godliness and was fairly advanced in age. Simeon calls him white-haired. It might be that he was willing to take on a dangerous job in which few others were interested. The recent experience of the bishops and community of Durham would have been a great advertisement. Although a secular cleric, Simeon would have us believe that Walcher was a monk in all but name, and it's likely that he had made some preparatory moves for the introduction of the Benedictine or some form of monastic rule that would eventually fall to his successor. What we know more certainly is that he brought quite a retinue of relatives and hangers-on with him. This was standard practice for a new bishop. These promotions were family affairs, but it was something that would come back to haunt him in time. If Walcher was an elderly foreigner, Wulfiof, the new earl, to whom the initial practical work of planning the new defences of this castle may well have fallen, was probably not yet 25. William seems to have had a soft spot for him. That may have been something to do with the suggestion that Wulfiof's late father had been an early supporter of William's claim to be made Edward the Confessor's heir. It may be that Wulfiof, being young, and some of the evidence suggests somewhat biddable, William considered him to be protégé potential. Wulfiof had substantial estates in the south of England, and in the management of these he had presumably shown some promise. Most importantly, he was of both Danish and Saxon blood, the son of a former Earl of Northumbria on his father's side, and a descendant of the line of Bamborough Earls through his mother. He had taken part, perhaps half-heartedly, in the rebellions of 1068 to 70, but he had quickly repented. William had not only forgiven him, but brought him into his family by marriage to his niece. Walcher and Wulfiof, the older bishop and the younger earl, were clearly intended to work together to rebuild and reinvigorate the city of St Cuthbert, such that it would provide the Norman monarchy with the northern stronghold it so badly needed. And at least at first, the partnership seems to have been a fruitful and cordial one. The Historia Regum Anglorum tells us that Wulfiof sat with the bishop in his synod and ensured that whatever was decreed was enacted throughout his earldom. Alas, little of this lasted. For reasons that remain obscure, in 1075 Wulfiof got himself embroiled in a rebel plot. Interestingly, led not by Northumbrians, but by disaffected Norman earls. He seems to have been dragged in almost by accident, and he soon regretted it, confessing all first to Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury and then to the king. No matter, he was stripped of his earldom, and the following year the conqueror's indulgence for his young nephew-in-law ran out. Wulfiof was executed outside Winchester early in the morning of the 31st of May, 1076. He was the only English nobleman to suffer that fate during William's reign. Walcher lasted a little longer. Having purchased the now vacant earldom, he temporarily united it with the office of bishop. Unfortunately, those relatives of his that I mentioned started causing trouble, and the upshot of that is well known. Walcher and his household were murdered at a summit in Gateshead, leading to another, in 1080, leading to another Norman ride north and another period of agonising brutality for Durham and Northumbria, this time at the hands of Bishop Odo Bayeux, William the Conqueror's half-brother. The castle, however, fared rather better. Building continued under Walcher's successors, most notably William of St Callis, Ranulph Flambard, and Hugh de Puiset. By the end of the 12th century, it looked reasonably recognisably like the building we know and love today. The rest, as they say, is history, 950 years worth and counting.